The shatter of glass against marble was not the loudest thing in the room that night. It was the silence that followed. Luisa Ferrante heard it from the kitchen corridor, a single breath of dead air swallowing the entire east drawing room whole, and she knew before she even rounded the corner that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She was not the kind of woman who moved fast. At 27, carrying 275 pounds on a 5'4" frame, Luisa had long since made peace with the fact that she would never be graceful. Her thick calves ached inside the compression socks she wore under her black uniform slacks. The polyester blend of her catering jacket pulled across her broad shoulders in ways the rental company had clearly not anticipated. She sweat through her collar by 8 p.m. on a good night. Tonight was not a good night. She had been working the Varro estate for 11 months, not as permanent staff. Luisa was too honest with herself to pretend she'd climbed any kind of ladder. She was contracted through a downtown hospitality agency, dispatched on weekends and high-event evenings to the neo-Gothic limestone mansion that sat behind iron gates on the north shore of Lake Michigan, where the kind of money that didn't advertise itself quietly accumulated across generations. She carried trays. She refilled glasses. She kept her eyes down and her movements deliberate, and she pretended not to notice the men who whispered in corners or the way conversations died the moment the estate's owner entered a room. Nico Varro. He was 41. Tall, angular, with close-cropped silver threading through dark hair at his temples, and the kind of stillness that predators have, not the restless energy of aggression, but something slower and far more permanent. He ran a legitimate import and logistics empire on paper. Off paper, the Varro family had controlled the Upper Midwest's organized distribution networks for 3 decades, and Nico had inherited the operation at 29 after his father's sudden coronary, and managed it with such cold precision that even the federal task force assigned to him had reportedly grown bored and moved on. Luisa had served him coffee twice. Both times, he had said thank you. Both times, she had been so disoriented by the courtesy that she nearly walked into a doorframe leaving the room. She was not supposed to have opinions about Nico Varro. She was supposed to be invisible. What she was not invisible to was his mother. Renata Varro was 74, originally from Palermo, and still the most immaculately dressed woman in any room she occupied. She wore her silver hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, wore her grief for her husband like a second skin, and wore her love for her son with a ferocity that frightened his enemies more than his reputation did. She was also, in the quiet and terrifying way that no one in the household spoke aloud, beginning to slip. Luisa had noticed it first 7 months ago, a Tuesday afternoon, off hours, when she'd been asked to stay late to help inventory the wine cellar. She'd found Renata in the conservatory at the back of the house, standing very still in front of a window, speaking softly in Italian to someone who wasn't there. When Luisa approached, Renata had turned to her with eyes that were somewhere else entirely, focused on a distance that no one else in the room could see. "Angelo," Renata had whispered, reaching for Luisa's wrist with a papery, trembling hand. "Angelo, you're late for supper." Luisa hadn't corrected her. She had simply taken the old woman's hand and said very softly, "I'm sorry, I got held up. Let's go inside where it's warm." She'd walked Renata back to her private sitting room, stayed until the older woman's eyes cleared and she became herself again, sharp and present, and immediately embarrassed. Then she'd brought her a cup of chamomile tea and sat with her in silence until the shaking stopped. Renata had never mentioned it again, but from that evening forward she called Luisa by name first, always first, before any of the permanent household staff, before her own personal aide. "You don't make me feel like a problem," Renata told her once, watching Luisa arrange the tea tray with her characteristically careful, unhurried movements. "Everyone else in this house looks at me like I'm something fragile they're waiting to break. You look at me like I'm simply a person who needs a cup of tea." Luisa had not known what to say to that. She'd handed over the cup and changed the subject. She kept Renata's condition to herself with the same stubborn, silent loyalty with which she kept everything else. Her student loan statements, the back rent she'd floated for her younger brother, twice in 6 months, the stress fracture in her left foot, she couldn't afford to have properly treated. You did not broadcast your vulnerabilities when you were a woman who looked like Luisa Ferrante. You endured, and you did the job, and you went home. The night everything fractured was a Saturday in mid-October. The Varro estate was hosting what the official invitation called a private investment summit, which was the kind of language that laundered the actual guest list into something printable. 37 men and 14 women moved through the grand rooms in bespoke black tie, drinking single malt scotch and Barolo, and speaking to each other in the careful cadences of people who had learned long ago never to say anything specific in a room with a ceiling. Luisa had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon. Her lower back was a single long note of pain. She'd already bumped one side table with her hip and sent a small bronze sculpture spinning, catching it before it hit the floor and replacing it without anyone noticing, she hoped. The other catering staff, younger and thinner and faster, moved through the crowd like water. Luisa moved through it like someone trying very hard not to be noticed while carrying a tray of Wagyu beef skewers and failing on both counts. She had just come through the rear kitchen corridor when she saw Nico's fiancé for the first time up close. Camille Ashford was 30, blonde, raised in Greenwich, and possessed of the kind of effortless, athletic elegance that came from 3 decades of being told you were exactly the right amount of everything. She was in a gown of ivory silk that required a figure like a greyhound's to wear correctly, and she wore it correctly, and she knew it. She was also, Luisa had gathered from 11 months of overheard conversations and small, telling observations, deeply interested in the Varro name, and remarkably uninterested in anything that came with it, including Nico's mother. The engagement had been announced 4 months ago. Luisa had heard the staff discussing it in low, skeptical voices. Renata, it was said, had not attended the announcement dinner. She had claimed a headache. The permanent household manager, a quiet man named Bautista, who had served the Varros for 18 years, had told Luisa privately, in the flat tones of someone reporting a weather forecast, that Renata had called Camille a woman who smiles with only her mouth. Luisa had said nothing and mentally noted the distinction. She was refilling the champagne station near the Eastern Hall when she registered that Renata was not at the table where she was supposed to be seated. The chair was empty, the champagne glass untouched. Luisa set the bottle down. She did not rush. Luisa was physically incapable of rushing in any way that looked like rushing. But she moved with a new and quiet urgency through the edge of the crowd, scanning. The main rooms were dense with people. The conservatory at the back of the house was quiet. At this hour, the lights low. It was exactly the kind of place Renata sometimes drifted toward when the noise became too much and her mind began to loosen at the edges. Luisa pushed through the narrow service door that cut through the butler's pantry and came out near the back of the house. The hallway was dim. At the far end, the conservatory doors stood half open, and through the gap, light fell at a low angle across the tile floor. She heard the voices before she reached the doors. "You are embarrassing yourself!" Camille's voice was controlled but cold in the way that very expensive control gets cold, like marble in January. "Standing in here alone talking to plants. Nico's guests can see the garden windows from the main hall. Do you understand how this looks? I was not talking to plants." Renata's voice was steady, but Luisa knew its textures now, knew the faint wobble beneath the dignity. "I was resting. I am allowed to rest in my own home. Your home." Camille made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's an interesting way to frame it. After the wedding, the estate moves into the family trust, which Nico and I will jointly administer. So You might want to begin thinking of this less as your home and more as an arrangement that we are generously extending to you for the foreseeable future. A long silence. I think, Renata said very quietly, that you should go back to the party. I think, Camille replied, her voice dropping to something sharper, that you should stop filling Nico's head with your opinions about me. He respects you. That's the only leverage you have left, and if you spend it on petty interference, you will find that I am very good at making inconvenient people disappear quietly. There are lovely facilities upstate. Very private. Very enough. Renata had stepped back, and in stepping back, her elbow caught the tall glass vase on the wrought iron stand behind her. It went over. The sound of it hitting the tile was enormous in the quiet room. Camille looked down at the shattered glass. Then she looked at Renata, and the control broke. You stupid old woman. Her voice was a flat, furious hiss. That was a Murano piece. Do you have any idea? She raised her hand, not an open palm. A closed fist. The large oval-cut diamond on her right hand turned inward, and her arm drew back with the deliberate, ugly intention of someone who had decided the calculation and accepted it. Luisa did not think. She had been told her entire life that her body was a liability. Too much of it, taking up too much space, moving too slowly, breathing too loudly, existing too visibly. But her body was also 275 pounds of mass moving through a door at the only speed it had. And when Luisa Ferrante lunged across the threshold of that conservatory, she had exactly one purpose. Her shoulder caught Camille's arm mid-swing. The impact was not graceful. Luisa's foot caught the lip of the door threshold, and she went down hard, her broad frame hitting the tile with a sound that reverberated through the entire back wing of the house. The diamond ring connected not with Renata's face, but with Luisa's forearm as she fell, the setting tearing a jagged line from her wrist to her elbow. She felt it as a white electric scream of sensation, and then the cold tile against her cheek, and then Renata's voice from very close, sharp and frantic and entirely present. Luisa, Luisa, look at me. Stay still. Don't move. Luisa looked up at the conservatory ceiling and noted, with the distant clarity of shock, that someone had strung small Edison bulbs through the hanging ferns, and that they were very beautiful. What, said a voice from the doorway, is happening in this room? It was not a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the voice of a man who had asked it as a statement of incoming reckoning. Nico Varro stood in the doorway. He was not alone. Two men flanked him, both large and still, and between the three of them, they occupied the frame completely. His eyes moved across the room with the speed and precision of someone conducting a rapid threat assessment. A habit so deeply ingrained it had apparently ceased to require conscious thought. He took in the shattered vase, the blood on Luisa's forearm, his mother kneeling on the tile floor. Camille standing 4 feet away, her hand still partially raised, her expression shifting rapidly through several calculations. Nico, Camille said. Her voice had recalibrated to something gentle and victimized in the span of a single breath. It was impressive, technically. Your mother. She knocked over the vase, and I was trying to help her, and this woman, the caterer, she just came charging through the door and fell, and I don't know why she... Nico raised one finger. Camille stopped. He crossed the room and crouched beside Luisa with a fluid economy of movement, one knee on the tile, and looked at the wound on her forearm. It was deep. The diamond had done significant damage. Hey. His voice, directed at Luisa, was completely different. It was quiet and direct and stripped of everything else. Look at me. What's your name? Luisa, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Luisa Ferrante. I work for the agency. I'm sorry about the door. Don't, he said it quietly. He pulled the folded pocket square from his jacket and pressed it against her forearm, his hand firm and sure. Don't apologize. What did you see? She met his eyes. They were dark gray, and she had been afraid of them for 11 months, and she was not afraid of them right now. She was going to hit your mother, Luisa said, with her ring hand. I couldn't. I wasn't fast enough to stop the swing. I just tried to get between them. Renata made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and the exhale of someone who has been holding a breath for a very long time. She placed both her hands over Nico's, over the pocket square, over Luisa's arm, and held them there. She told the truth, Renata said, in the careful, anchored voice she used when she was working very hard to stay present. Everything the girl said is the truth. Nico stood. He turned to look at Camille. Whatever Camille saw in his face in that moment, and Luisa, from her position on the floor, watched it happen. It emptied her of her composure completely. The performance dissolved. What was underneath it was ordinary and frightened and young. "The engagement is over," Nico said. "You cannot be serious." Camille's voice cracked. "Over a catering worker? Nico, do you have any idea what my family will say? What this will cost you politically, the connections my father has?" "You raised your hand to my mother." He said it with a flatness that was somehow more absolute than rage. "There is no version of this conversation that ends differently. You have 10 minutes to get your things from the guest suite. After that, the gates close and you leave with what you're wearing." One of the men in the doorway stepped forward. Camille looked at him, then back at Nico, and then something in her went very still and very cold, and she understood. She picked up her clutch from the side table where she'd set it, and she walked out of the conservatory without another word, her heels sharp and rapid on the marble corridor floor, fading away. The room was quiet except for Luisa's breathing and the soft, involuntary sounds Renata was making while she held Luisa's arm. "Get the car," Nico said to the man in the doorway, "and call Halverson. Tell him I need the surgical suite at the private clinic on Dearborn prepped. Laceration, possible nerve involvement." He looked at his mother. "Can you walk?" "I am perfectly capable of walking," Renata said with great dignity, and then allowed her son to help her to her feet without protest, which was, Luisa had learned, her particular form of grace. Nico looked down at Luisa. "Can you stand?" "I can try," Luisa said, which was honest. He helped her. He did it without ceremony, getting an arm under her and bearing her weight with a steadiness that made her realize, distantly, that she had been bracing herself for the slight, the almost imperceptible hesitation that people gave when they were asked to physically support someone her size. There was none. He simply helped her stand, kept his hand at her elbow until she had her footing, and then walked with her toward the door. The clinic on Dearborn was private and immaculate, and staffed, apparently, by a physician named Halverson, who did not ask questions and arrived at 11:30 on a Saturday night in a cable-knit sweater, as though he had simply been waiting to be called. He stitched the laceration in the wound with the focus of someone solving a puzzle he found genuinely interesting, and told Luisa she'd been extraordinarily lucky. A centimeter deeper and she'd have had significant tendon involvement. Luisa sat on the edge of the clinic bed and absorbed the information and did not say what she was thinking, which was that luck had not been the operative variable in that room. Nico was in the corridor when she came out. He was on a phone call that he ended when he heard the door, and he looked at her arm in its white bandaging and then at her face and said, "Sit down. There's something you need to know." She sat. He sat across from her, forearms on his knees, and explained it in the efficient, unadorned way he seemed to do everything. Camille Ashford had not come to the engagement through conventional channels. Her father, a man named Royce Ashford, who had significant financial interests that overlapped uncomfortably with the Varro family's operations, had brokered the match 18 months ago as a mechanism of access. A slow infiltration dressed up as a love story. Nico had known this going in. He was not, he said without inflection, a man who was easily deceived. What he had not fully anticipated was the jewelry. Halverson had taken a scraping from the wound on Luisa's arm. The diamond setting on Camille's ring had been treated, a synthetic compound, odorless, absorbed directly through broken skin, designed to cause cardiac arrhythmia that would present in a healthy-seeming individual as an inexplicable and untraceable heart event. The compound required direct contact with blood to activate. The ring had been designed for Nico, an intimate moment, a scratch that could be explained away, a man found dead in his bed with no evidence of anything. Instead, the ring had torn through the arm of a catering worker who had thrown herself across a doorway to shield an old woman from being struck, and the compound had entered Luisa Ferrante's bloodstream through a wound that ran from her wrist to her elbow. "How bad?" Luisa said when he finished. "Halverson is optimistic. Your size is actually a factor in your favor. The compound disperses through body mass, and it hits critical concentration more slowly. He's already started the countermeasure, but you'll need to be monitored for the next 72 hours at minimum." Nico paused. "I'm taking you back to the estate. There's a medical room. Halverson will stay." Luisa looked at him. "I have a brother," she said. "He needs to know where I am. We'll contact him, and I have a shift on Thursday." "You don't work for the agency anymore," Nico said. She stared at him. "I got fired?" "No." Something moved briefly through his expression that might, in another man, have been the beginning of a wry smile. "I bought out your contract. You work for the estate now, directly." He held her gaze. "If you want to." She thought about the compression socks and the aching foot and the polyester jacket that never fit correctly, and the way she had spent 11 months making herself small and quiet and unremarkable in his house, and she thought about Renata's hand over hers on the clinic floor, pressing down against the wound, staying with her. "I want to," Luisa said. What happened in the 72 hours that followed was swift and thorough in the way that Nico Varro apparently did everything. Royce Ashford's financial architecture, it turned out, had been built on the assumption that the Varro family would remain a passive host rather than an active respondent. That assumption did not survive contact with the reality of Nico's underboss, a precise and unhurried man named Carver, who had spent the better part of 2 decades quietly cataloging every leverage point in the upper Midwest's organized financial landscape and waiting with apparent contentment for an occasion to use them. The occasion arrived on a Sunday morning. By Sunday evening, 3 of Atwood's import licenses had been administratively suspended through channels that would take his legal team a minimum of 8 months to untangle. His primary financing partner, a private equity group with significant exposure to Varro logistics contracts, had received a quiet communication from their institutional investor that prompted an emergency board call. 2 city aldermen who had been reliably helpful to Ashford's interests over the years received by courier documentation that they would very much prefer had remained private. Camille was not arrested. There was no evidence that would have survived the chain of custody required for criminal prosecution. And Nico had not built 3 decades of operational security to compromise it for the satisfaction of a public spectacle. Instead, Camille Ashford found that every door she had moved through on the basis of the Varro connection had, without announcement or explanation, closed, quietly, permanently, in the way that doors in that world close, which is to say, with no drama and no appeal and no recourse. She and her father left Chicago by the end of the month. Luisa spent the first 4 days in the medical room at the estate, which was not the sterile institutional space she'd braced herself for, but a proper guest room with a window overlooking the back garden and a bed with a mattress that made her feel faintly guilty for how comfortable it was. Halverson came twice daily. Renata came more often than that. The older woman brought her things, a particular Italian biscuit she had made herself, a very old novel in English with penciled annotations in the margins, a small framed photograph of Lake Como in summer that she set on the windowsill without explanation and then never removed. On the 3rd afternoon, Renata sat in the chair beside the bed and held Luisa's unbandaged hand and said, very quietly, "My son asked me this morning what I thought of you." Luisa said nothing, I told him the truth, Renata said, that you are the only person in this house who has ever treated me like I was still worth something. Not an object to be managed, not a problem to be solved. She squeezed Luisa's hand once. Whatever he decides to do with that information is his business, but I wanted you to know that I told him. Luisa looked at the photograph on the windowsill for a long time after Renata left. On the 5th day, the bandaging came down to a lighter dressing, and Halverson declared the countermeasure successful, with the satisfaction of a man who had genuinely enjoyed the technical challenge. And Luisa got up and dressed in actual clothes. The agency had sent a bag from her apartment, packed by her brother, who had apparently included every item of clothing she owned that he considered the good ones, which was touching and slightly mortifying in equal measure, and she walked downstairs for the first time. She was standing in the kitchen, making tea, because it was the thing her hands knew how to do, and she needed her hands to do something familiar when Nico came in. He was in a dark sweater and no jacket, and looked, for the first time in 11 months of observation, like a person who lived in a house rather than a man conducting operations inside one. He looked at her standing at the stove, and something in him settled, almost imperceptibly, like a room that has been slightly off-level coming to rest. "You should be resting," he said. "I've been resting for 5 days," Luisa said. "I'm going to lose my mind." He crossed to the cabinet and took down a second mug without being asked and set it on the counter near her, and she understood that as the kind of gesture it was. Not dramatic, not declarative, just a small, deliberate thing that meant, I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and there is room at this counter for both of us. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "Okay." The position Bautista manages, overseeing the household staff, the estate coordination. He's been wanting to retire for 2 years. He's staying because he doesn't trust anyone I've brought in so far. Nico looked at her steadily. "I'd like to offer it to you. Full salary, benefits, housing here at the estate if you want it. Your brother is welcome as well if the situation would be easier." Luisa looked at the second mug on the counter. She thought about all the ways she had been told, in all the years before this one, that she was wrong for the room she was in. Too much, too slow, too visible, taking up too much space in a world that preferred its inconvenient people to make themselves smaller and quieter and easier to overlook. "I don't have experience managing a household at this level," she said honestly. "I know." He said it without apology. "I also know that you have been managing my mother's well-being for 7 months without being asked to, without compensation, and without telling anyone, and that you knew on instinct in the dark, in under 2 seconds, what was happening in that conservatory and what it required." He met her eyes. "I don't need a resume, I need someone who pays attention and doesn't flinch." The kettle came to a boil. Luisa poured the water and did not spill it. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Take as long as you need." She thought about it for approximately 40 seconds. "Yes," she said. She handed him the second mug, and he took it, and they stood at the counter in the quiet kitchen of the house that had once tried its best to make her invisible. And the morning light came through the east window and found them both, standing in it, unhidden, taking up exactly as much space as they needed. The girl who had spent a year learning to disappear had, without quite planning it, become someone that the most dangerous household in Chicago could not afford to lose.